So you're halfway through making a track, the vibes are going great in the studio, the track is sounding really good, but all of a sudden the audio starts breaking up. It starts glitch. It starts glitching. There is nothing more frustrating, and it's because you're throwing too much stuff at it. Big plugins all trying to take the memory within Ableton and the audio are starting to suffer. But don't worry, I'm going to show you 3 tips in this video of how to get around that and back to producing. Now we're living in an amazing time where we have just about every sound at our fingertips. The most amazing soft synths to kind of create any sound that we can think of. The most amazing audio effects to craft and sculpt those sounds. And mastering chains that can master a whole track within one plugin. But of course, the more and more plugins that we add to a project, the more load on our computer. It basically takes a toll, and what happens is when Ableton slows down, the audio is affected, the audio output is affected, and what we start hearing is glitching. Now glitching is where the sound starts delaying and it starts adding some audio artifacts almost that just generally just don't sound great, and it's quite hard to get an idea of where the track's going when it's kind of glitching and it's not in time, or it's just generally doing some very weird stuff. Now I've got 3 tips that I'm going to go over in this video of ways to kind of get around that. Now this is not going to get around it within every project. If you've got an older computer that maybe doesn't have that many resources, then you're probably going to run into this a lot quicker, and some of these tips might help, but it might not solve every issue. However, with these 3 tips, I've been able to get through 90% of the issues that I've had in the past, and they're all to do with saving your computer and saving Ableton using so much memory, and just generally improving the sound playback. So the first and most effective tip out of all 3 of these is freezing tracks. Now this is something I do all the time in my projects, and I find it really, really helpful. So in your projects you have a load of different tracks, and every track has got a load of different plugins on it. So the first plugin you'll have is probably your instruments. So say for example you've got a soft synth on there which is providing the sound. You then might have a few different audio effects after it which is processing the sound. Now each one of those on that chain is using a certain amount of memory. Now the plugins within Ableton are pretty good for memory really, but if you're using a lot of third-party plugins or third-party instruments, then they might use quite a bit more memory. So the best thing you can do is try and save that memory when you can. So once you've kind of got that track sorted, you've got that instrument sounding how you want it to, you can right click on it and choose to freeze the track. Now basically what this does is it renders that track on its own. Think of it a bit like a stem. It kind of renders that track and keeps it frozen. So basically what it's doing is it's not using that soft synth anymore to provide that sound. It's not using any of those audio effects anymore. It's just basically an audio file in its place. But at any point you can right click on that track and unfreeze it again if you want to make any changes. So this works remarkably well, and it saves so much memory on your system. You'll notice very quickly that your system will speed up quite a bit, especially if you're using big soft synths that are using a lot of memory on your system. So quickly, just before we move on, I just want to say if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel down below and hit the notification icon so you're notified whenever I upload a brand new video. Got a load more stuff like this on the way, so you might want to do that. So freezing MIDI tracks is a great technique, especially if you love using those big plugins that use a lot of memory. But that's just one of the ways in which Ableton can glitch if it doesn't have enough memory. The other one is disk usage. So as you probably know, I'm a big fan of using audio samples within my tracks, and they're all stored on my hard drive. Now say for example I've got an Ableton project set up and I've got 20 different tracks within there, and on each one of those tracks I've got a different audio sample. Now if I play all that back, then Ableton needs to read every one of those audio samples from the hard drive and play it back at the same time. Now if you've got a slow hard drive, then that might cause some issues because it can't read it from the hard drive quick enough, and that can cause glitching. But this second tip, I'm going to show you how to get around that. Whenever you drop an audio sample into Ableton, you can go into the properties of it and you'll see a button there that says RAM. If you hit that and enable it, that will then put that audio sample into memory rather than being read from the hard drive. So every time that sample is played, instead of being read from hard drive each time, it's actually coming straight out of memory. Now, of course, this depends on how much memory you've got on your system, and like we said with the freezing tracks, you might actually run out of that as well. But you've got to do this kind of fine balancing act between putting some of it in RAM and some of it from the hard drive. So I tend to combine the first and the second tip together. I will freeze my MIDI tracks to save up on memory, and then I'll load my audio files into that memory so that they're not using the hard drive. So it depends on how quick your hard drive is, how much memory you've got as to what you need to do. You might want to strike a balance between the two, so maybe put some of the audio files in RAM and some of them still from the disk. It's totally up to you. You can see which works best for you. So I usually find a combination between those two tips works really well. It fixes most of the glitches, most of the dropouts. But if you're still having those issues, one thing you can do is increase your buffer size. So what is buffer size? Well, basically buffer is the amount of time that it takes your computer to process the audio information. So the larger the buffer size, the longer it's going to take to do that. So you might think, well, why not just whack it all the way up and then obviously it's going to be so much better, I'm not going to get any glitching. Well, you need to have a lower buffer to be able to have lower latency. So what is latency? Well, say for example, if I'm playing a MIDI keyboard and it triggers a soft synth within Ableton, well, the latency is the time between that, between the hitting a key and you hearing a sound within your soft synth. Now, if you've got low latency, then there's barely any time between the two. But the more you put your buffer size up, the more latency there is, you might get more time between the two. So you might actually hit the key on the MIDI keyboard and then half a second later, you might hear it through Ableton. So it's not that great if you're if you want to do things in real time, if you want to record some more live performance in. But if you're getting kind of midway through your project or coming towards the end of it, then maybe increasing that buffer time maybe not be a bad thing. It just means when you want to do some more real-time edits or some more real-time performance, then you're going to have a bit of problem with latency. So those are the three things that I look at every time I have glitching or dropouts within Ableton. Usually going through those three tips can usually solve most of the issues you get with glitching. But if you're still getting some issues, then it might be to do with your hardware. You might have an older sound card. You might not have the latest drivers for your sound card. You might have an older computer that's just not up to the task anymore. Remember, all these plugins and Ableton, they're using more and more resources these days. So unfortunately, at some point, you might need to upgrade. But hopefully these three tips can help. They might relieve some of that pressure on your system and get you back into producing again. So I hope you like this video. Give it a like if you have. Subscribe if you haven't already. And hit the notification icon so you're notified whenever I upload a brand new video. I've got a ton of content like this on my channel. So definitely check out my other vids, and I'll see you in the next video.